Welcome to the Hindu Daily.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, so imagine finding a cure for a deadly disease, right?
Yeah.
Giving the medicine away for free and still watching patients die, not because the drugs failed, but because of, well, sheer loneliness.
Yeah, or simply because they couldn't afford a bus ticket to the actual clinic.
Exactly. Today's deep dive is a journey through those kinds of systemic failures and the structural fixes we need to overcome them. We are taking you on a map that starts with the grassroots fight against tuberculosis in vulnerable communities, scales up to record-breaking quantum physics, navigates these sudden political earthquakes in Nepal, and then ends with the harsh realities of global industrial shocks.
It is a massive scope today.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the global fight against tuberculosis. So the World Health Organization just dropped some major recommendations right before World TB Day. We are looking at near point-of-care molecular tests, utilizing tongue swabs instead of just sputum, and deploying AI-enabled portable chest X-rays. It really feels like the entire diagnostic landscape is shifting from a passive system to an active one.
Yeah, it absolutely is because, the old approach in places like India relied incredibly heavily on sputum smear microscopy.
Which isn't great, right?
No, it's really not. That method has notoriously low sensitivity, and it cannot identify if a patient is carrying a drug-resistant strain of TB.
Ah, right.
So now the National Tuberculosis Elimination Program is deploying these mobile vans, and they're equipped with these portable AI-driven X-ray machines going directly into communities, specifically targeting, highly vulnerable urban and tribal settings.
If I can use an analogy here, the old way was like identifying a massive crime scene,
Yeah.
but making all the potential suspects travel, miles to the precinct for questioning.
Exactly, and a lot of people just wouldn't show up.
Right. But now we are taking the detective directly to the crime scene.
Yeah, and the reason this matters so much is that it prevents attrition in the diagnostic cascade.
Meaning people falling through the cracks.
Right. When you bring the screening into the community, you catch the disease much earlier in its progression. But the critical mechanism here is immediate action. So, if the AI flags a suspicious X-ray, health workers have to collect a swab or sample right then and there.
Because if they don't?
If you let the patient walk away with instructions to visit a clinic later, you almost guarantee you lose them to follow up.
Yeah, that makes sense. The technology is brilliant, obviously, but tools are basically useless without the trust of the community to actually wield them. Which brings us to the human element of TB care.
The social side.
Right. There's this incredibly striking story from 2017 about Cedric Fernandez. He's a TB survivor and advocate. And he's standing in a room full of other survivors in New Delhi. And he asked this just haunting question. He said, "It has been very lonely having this disease, what took so long to bring us together."
Man, that quote just captures a historic blind spot in the global TB response. Well, for decades, the approach was stubbornly biomedical. Policymakers focused entirely on clinical interventions and just ignored the lived daily experiences of the patients.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. There was this widespread assumption that unlike HIV advocates, TB patients just wanted to swallow their pills, get cured, and, move on with their lives. The establishment really didn't believe survivors would want to stick around to become peer supporters.
But let me push back on that for a second. If the national program is finally providing, high-quality, free drugs and better diagnostics right at the doorstep,
Right.
why does a purely clinical approach still fail? Shouldn't free medicine cure a biological disease?
You'd think so, but TB doesn't exist in a social vacuum. Stigma uniquely and disproportionately impacts vulnerable groups. We're talking women, transgender communities, adolescents.
Right.
When you are ostracized by your community, and this happens hidden away by your own family due to fear of infection, getting a free pill doesn't solve the crushing social isolation.
Yeah, I can see that.
So the Survivor to Champion movement fundamentally changes this dynamic. These TB champions provide peer counseling, which drastically reduces self-stigmatization and improves treatment literacy.
Because they've been there.
Exactly. They serve as living, breathing proof to the community that TB is curable. It bridges the gap between a clinical prescription and actual human recovery.
Treating that social isolation is obviously crucial. But medically speaking, social isolation isn't the only thing existing in a vacuum. The disease inside the patient's body doesn't exist in isolation either.
Right, the comorbidities.
Yes, we have to look at integrated care.
Yeah.
Take the story of Divya. She's a 48-year-old woman recently diagnosed with TB. But she also happened to have poorly controlled diabetes with an HbA1c over 10.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is the bidirectional relationship between these conditions.
Bidirectional.
Yeah, meaning they feed off each other. India carries a massive diabetes burden. And the biochemical reality is that people with diabetes have altered immune responses, making them far more likely to develop active TB.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and if you have both, your TB treatment outcomes are generally much poorer. In a Chennai cohort tracking over 9,000 people with TB, researchers found that 34% also had diabetes.
Wow, over a third.
And of those, 41% had poor glycemic control. So the program is now rolling out bidirectional screening, meaning you screen TB patients for diabetes and diabetes patients for TB.
It's like trying to fix a leaky roof while completely ignoring a rotting foundation. I mean, you have to treat the whole house.
That's a great way to put it. This highlights why the transition from disease-specific care to person-centered care is simply non-negotiable. Another excellent demonstration of this is a ReachH pilot project conducted in Bihar and Tamil Nadu.
What do they do?
They screened 26,000 people who presented with respiratory symptoms, but ultimately tested negative for TB.
Okay.
Now, because they utilized an integrated approach rather than just sending them home, they identified and linked nearly 3,000 of those individuals to critical care for COPD and asthma.
That's incredible. So if a patient's body is the house, nutrition is absolutely the mortar holding it together.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the Rations trial in Jharkhand, which focused on the devastating impact of severe undernutrition.
The results there were amazing.
The physical transformations documented are staggering. Consider a 19-year-old named Ramlal. He weighed just 26 kilograms and was completely bedbound when diagnosed with lung TB.
26 kilos that's just severe starvation.
Right, but after receiving anti-TB drugs alongside a monthly food basket, he started walking, then cycling to work, and his weight stabilized at 42 kilograms.
Wow.
Then there's Laxmi. She weighed 34 kilograms and actually had to stop her medication entirely because her frail body couldn't handle the drug toxicity. But with nutritional support, she adhered to her meds and was even able to breastfeed her baby.
Yeah, undernutrition is a major reversible risk factor for death, severe drug toxicity, and relapse in TB patients. Biologically, severe caloric and protein deficits basically cripple the immune system.
Which lets the TB take over.
Exactly. It contributes to nearly 40% of all new TB cases in India. So, the Rations trial provided a highly practical intervention, a 10-kilogram monthly food basket.
Just basic staples.
Yeah, cereals, pulses, milk powder, and oil. That simple provision led to an average weight gain of 4.5 kilograms. And achieving just a 5% weight gain in the first 2 months reduced the patient's risk of death by an astonishing 60%.
Here's where it gets really interesting today. We spend, billions of dollars and decades of research looking for high-tech pharmaceutical solutions. Yet, in this trial, providing extra rice and just 1.5 kilograms of pulses per family member acted almost like a vaccine.
It really did.
It cut new TB cases within those families by half.
Because poverty and food insecurity are the primary engines driving the disease. The World Health Organization actually released new guidelines last year, drawing significantly from the Rations trial data. Ensuring nutrition security is proving to be just as medically vital as the clinical medication itself.
So nourishing the body is half the battle. But the other half is the invisible toll TB takes on the mind. Just how big is the intersection between mental health and an infectious disease like TB?
It is vastly underreported. Anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of people dealing with TB or HIV experience co-occurring mental health conditions, severe depression and anxiety being the most common.
That's a huge percentage.
Yeah, and this has a direct, measurable clinical impact. If someone is battling untreated depression, they lack the executive function and motivation to take a rigorous, multi-month regimen of TB medication regularly.
Oh, and if they skip doses.
Exactly. That irregular adherence is exactly what breeds drug-resistant TB strains.
What about the collateral damage to the families? Because, watching a loved one go through that while managing the intense isolation and the inevitable financial hit of lost wages, that have to be devastating.
The caregiver burden is immense, and it creates a really dangerous psychological loop. Studies show that up to 80% of caregivers exhibit high-expressed negative emotions, or EE.
What does that look like in practice?
It's primarily due to emotional burnout and financial strain. In India's deeply family-centered ecosystem, This stress manifests as over-involved or highly critical caregiving.
Like hovering or getting frustrated with a patient.
Right, and paradoxically, this high-pressure environment leads to poorer treatment outcomes for the patient. We need a syndemic approach. We cannot just hand the patient an antidepressant. It requires comprehensive psychoeducation for the entire family unit to manage the household stress.
We've just spent the first part of this deep dive exploring how human resilience can overcome massive biological and mental pressure. Now let's pivot to how scientists are using literal, intense physical pressure to unlock real-world superpowers.
The superconductivity breakthrough.
Yes, we are talking about ambient pressure superconductivity.
This breakthrough has the global physics community on edge. A team at the University of Houston, led by Liangzi Deng and Qingwu Chu, managed to achieve superconductivity at room pressure at a temperature of minus 122 degrees Celsius.
Which is still cold, but
But for this field, it's huge. They utilized a copper oxide material known as Hg1223. That smashes a critical temperature record that has stood untouched since 1993.
okay, for those of us who aren't quantum physicists, the team used something called a pressure quench protocol.
Right.
To me, it sounds a bit like baking a cake under intense pressure. You compress this crystal to 30 gigapascals, which is just an unfathomable amount of crushing force. Then you cool it down to minus 269 degrees Celsius.
He's very cold.
Right. And finally, you rapidly release the pressure. It's like freezing that cake instantly so the internal structure doesn't collapse when you take it out of the oven. Very close.
That is actually a brilliant way to picture it. The atomic mechanics follow that exact logic. When they rapidly release the pressure while the material is at that extreme cryogenic state, the atoms simply lack the thermal energy to relax back into their normal, non-superconducting structure.
So they get stuck.
Exactly. The process permanently traps structural defects and internal strains. Those trapped strains lock in the superconducting properties even after the material is returned to normal, everyday atmospheric pressure. Testing showed roughly 78% of the material's volume became superconducting.
Meaning they achieve bulk superconductivity, not just those fragile little filamentary channels, right?
Right. Filamentary superconductivity means the electrical current is only traveling through microscopic thread-like channels.
Which break easily.
Exactly. They snap easily under heavy electrical loads. Bulk superconductivity means the entire material can reliably carry massive amounts of electricity without resistance. If this process can be stabilized and scaled for manufacturing, it could revolutionize global power grids by entirely eliminating transmission losses.
Oh, wow.
And completely transform the capabilities of MRI machines and high-speed maglev trains.
But I have to ask the obvious question here. This specific field has been plagued by massive controversies recently.
Oh, absolutely.
I am thinking of the high-profile Rangadias retractions in Nature and all that viral hype around the LK99 material out of South Korea last year that turned out to be a complete bust. How do we know this isn't another false alarm?
The scientific community's skepticism is completely warranted here. However, several factors separate this from recent scandals.
Okay.
First, the Houston team's data was highly reproducible across multiple tests, and they utilized a well-understood, heavily studied material in Hg1223.
So they aren't claiming some magic new rock.
Right, rather than claiming to have discovered a brand new mysterious compound.
Yeah.
Second is the sheer credibility of Professor Qingwu Chu. He is a titan in this field.
Really?
Back in 1987, his groundbreaking work led to an American Physical Society session so momentous it was literally dubbed the Woodstock of Physics.
Wow.
Yeah. With a decades-old reputation and a National Medal of Science, he is not a researcher who would risk his legacy on manipulated or hasty data.
So physics just broke a decades-old barrier by applying intense pressure and suddenly releasing it. We're seeing that exact same dynamic play out in the geopolitical landscape of Nepal, actually, where a frustrated electorate just released decades of political pressure.
That's a great transition.
Thank you. Let's look at the rise of Balendra Shah, the rapper and engineer turned mayor, and his Rastriya Swatantra Party, the RSP.
It is a genuine political earthquake. Nepal's post-Gen Z electorate is deeply cynical about systemic corruption, and they just handed a massive two-thirds majority mandate to an alternative political force.
And Shah joined them right before the election.
Yeah, he officially joined a mere 6 weeks before the polls.
What fascinates me is his campaign strategy. It was almost monastic. I mean, in a landscape historically filled with loud ideological grandstanding, he spoke for maybe 30 minutes total throughout the entire campaign.
Which is unheard of.
Right. He avoided traditional media interviews, and he never actually asked anyone for a vote. It resonated deeply with an exhausted young electorate. But you can't govern on silence forever. So what does this all mean for Nepal's foreign policy moving forward?
Well, Nepal sits on a highly precarious geopolitical tightrope between India and China. Historically, Nepali politics followed rigid, predictable scripts.
Like what?
The Nepali Congress generally leaning toward Delhi and communist factions leaning toward Beijing. Shah is countering these immense external pressures by projecting a hyper-local, fiercely nationalist image.
Giving an example of that.
Sure, as mayor, he provocatively hung a Greater Nepal map in his office. This was a direct retort to an Akan Varat mural displayed in India's new parliament building.
Oh.
Simultaneously, he signaled caution toward Beijing by quietly dropping a major China-backed industrial park from his party's manifesto.
Stepping back from these massive geopolitical tug-of-wars to reframe the narrative entirely around local sovereignty.
Yes. But his first actual baptism by fire likely won't be a direct confrontation with India or China. It will be navigating the escalating U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict.
Wait, how does the Middle East affect Nepal so directly?
Millions of Nepali migrants work across the Gulf. Their vital remittances, plus Nepal's critical energy lifelines, are heavily tied up in that region's stability. Shah will have to rapidly balance his nationalist doctrine with the strategic pragmatism of needing India's logistical depth and naval reach as a regional first responder if conditions deteriorate in the Middle East.
That political earthquake is sending massive aftershocks right into New Delhi. How does India handle this sudden new mandate?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, New Delhi must completely discard any lingering British-India mindsets.
Meaning?
There can be no impulse for political micromanagement. They have to avoid the coercive shadow of events like the 2015 border blockade. India needs to recognize this as part of a wider regional trend.
Right, because we've seen this elsewhere.
Exactly. We have seen similar youth-led demands for transparency and governance in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. When young populations topple old, entrenched establishments, it shouldn't automatically be labeled as an anti-India movement just because the ousted old guard happened to be pro-India.
Right. The voters were seeking domestic renewal, not adjudicating global strategies. They want jobs, they want tangible economic growth, and they want to reverse the heartbreaking trend of migrating abroad just to survive.
Yes.
Which means the honeymoon phase for Shah could end very quickly if he doesn't deliver on those economic promises. Bashing the old guard is great for winning an election, but it doesn't build infrastructure.
True. But Nepal could serve as a highly effective, dynamic partner for India in a sub-regional strategy for rapid economic growth, provided both sides prioritize people-centric, pragmatic policies over historic ideological posturing.
Shah needs accurate signals from his electorate to survive politically. And in climate science, relying on accurate signals is literally a matter of planetary survival.
Let's talk about the ocean data.
Yes, let's pivot to this fierce debate over how we measure the health of the Earth itself. So, a recent journal paper generated headlines by claiming that the oceans aren't warming, basically suggesting that global warming essentially isn't happening.
Yeah, it is a paper that utilizes highly sophisticated terminology, but fundamentally misunderstands how modern climate data is collected, processed, and validated.
I want to break down the skeptic's argument here so you, the listener, can spot the flaw. Their primary claim is that you can't just average intensive properties like temperature to figure out how much heat the entire ocean holds.
Right.
For context, an intensive property means the value doesn't change based on the size or mass of the material, like how the temperature of a cup of boiling water is the same as a massive pot of boiling water.
By that logic, humanity couldn't measure average air pressure or calculate global sea level rise either, but more importantly, modern oceanographers aren't just taking scattered temperatures and drawing a simple average.
What are they doing instead?
They are calculating thermal energy. Thermal energy is the total kinetic energy of the water molecules, which is an extensive property.
Wow.
Extensive properties absolutely depend on mass and volume, meaning they can be rigorously quantified, averaged, and tracked over decades.
Okay, let me push back with what sounds like their most damning claim.
Yeah.
The paper aggressively attacks the data coming from Argo, floats those autonomous devices drifting deep in the ocean, measuring temperature and salinity.
Yeah, the Argo network is crucial.
The skeptics claim that the way Argo data is cross-calibrated with Ceres satellite data is completely circular. They argue climate scientists are using Argo to correct the satellites and then using the satellites to validate Argo. Is that actually happening?
It sounds like a massive conspiracy, but it misrepresents a standard transparent calibration process called EBAF energy balanced and filled.
Okay, how does EBAF work?
So Ceres satellites orbit the Earth, measuring incoming solar radiation and outgoing radiation at the top of the atmosphere. This helps calculate how much heat is left behind on Earth. But the raw Ceres data has a tiny, constant margin of instrumental uncertainty. So scientists make a one-time adjustment to the mean energy flux to match the known, highly accurate baseline measured by the physical Argo floats down in the water.
This is where it gets a bit dense. If I can use a real-world analogy to break that down,
Yeah.
it's like buying a new digital thermometer for your house. It might constantly read 2 degrees colder than the old, reliable mercury thermometer you have on the wall.
Right.
So you calibrate the new digital one, you shift its baseline up by 2 degrees so they match. But if the house gets 5 degrees hotter over the afternoon, both thermometers will accurately show that 5-degree increase, regardless of where the baseline started.
That is the perfect way to understand EBAF calibration. It only adjusts the overall baseline average. It does absolutely nothing to alter the month-to-month or year-to-year differences in the data.
Okay, so the trends remain the same.
Exactly. If the raw satellite data shows an increase of 1 watt per square meter between 2005 and 2015, the adjusted data still shows that exact same increase. That upward trend, the actual undeniable evidence of global warming, comes entirely from the raw satellite measurements, completely untouched by the Argo calibration process.
And beyond that, scientists aren't just relying on thermometers and satellites looking at radiation, right? There are entirely independent data sets confirming this.
Yes, through basic physics. Altimetry satellites use radar to measure precise sea level rise, and GRACE satellites use anomalies in Earth's gravity to measure exactly how much new water is added from melting ice sheets.
Because water has mass.
Right. When you subtract the volume of the new meltwater, you can calculate precisely how much the ocean has physically expanded simply because water expands as it heats up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that thermal expansion data matches the Argo heat data perfectly. We arrive at the exact same terrifying conclusion from completely different mathematical and physical starting points.
Having undeniable data on the climate crisis is step one. Step two is translating that data into actionable policy, which is exactly where the fight for clean air in Delhi is stumbling.
It's a frustrating cycle.
As winter ends, we see the exact same cycle. Pollution spikes to hazardous levels, emergency steps are taken, the season changes, and then structural air quality barely improves.
Because we are obsessively treating the symptoms while ignoring the structural cause? If policymakers want clean air in Delhi, transport policy must be the absolute center of the strategy.
Not just crop burning or construction.
No. A decade of empirical evidence shows vehicular transport contributes 20 to 40% of PM 2.5 in Delhi annually. During the peak pollution months in winter, when you isolate strictly local sources, transport causes over 50% of the toxic particulate matter. It is responsible for roughly 13,000 premature deaths in the city every single year.
And the citywide monitors that get reported on the news actually understate the immediate danger to you. I mean, if you are a pedestrian walking to work or riding an open-air auto rickshaw, your localized exposure to tailpipe pollution is 20 to 40% higher than what the generalized city average claims.
It's hyper-localized exposure.
So how are we trying to fix this? Mostly through demand-side subsidies, like handing out cash rebates to convince people to buy electric vehicles, but relying solely on EV subsidies in a market dominated by combustion engines is like trying to cool down a hot oven by leaving the refrigerator door open. You need to turn off the heat source first.
Exactly. Subsidies severely strain public finances and fail to give the manufacturing industry the long-term certainty it needs to scale up alternative technologies. What Delhi needs are supply-side regulations, SSRs.
What do those look like in practice?
Supply-side regulations mandate market outcomes rather than just hoping for voluntary consumer behavioral changes. This means establishing a credible, binding timeline to phase out internal combustion engine vehicles entirely.
Like saying, by this year, you can't sell these anymore.
Right. It also means implementing radically tighter fuel efficiency standards, especially for freight transport, which is incredibly energy-intensive and highly polluting.
It's about giving manufacturers predictable investment signals. If a government puts strict zero-emission sales mandates in place, the auto industry knows exactly where the market is going by law. They won't just keep producing a profitable mix of clean and dirty vehicles indefinitely, which only dilutes any real gains in air quality.
Global evidence shows that where binding supply-side regulations are enforced, Emissions cuts are far deeper and more economically resilient. You cannot just throw financial incentives at the problem. You have to structurally mandate what is legally allowed to be supplied to the market.
Now, supply-side regulation assumes that you have a stable, functional global supply chain to regulate in the first place. But what happens when a geopolitical flashpoint suddenly chokes those exact supply chains?
And that is the billion-dollar question.
That brings us to our final story. Martina Neiswonger is the owner of a German chemical company called Gachem. After surviving the pandemic lockdowns, the Ukraine war energy spike, and shifting global tariffs, she is now holding daily crisis meetings and literally taking her frustration out on a punching bag in her office.
I don't blame her. She is highly emblematic of Europe's middle stand, the mid-sized manufacturing firms that serve as the absolute backbone of the continent's economy.
Right.
Gachem processes sulfamic acid into household cleaning products, but because of the escalating conflict in the Middle East and the effective blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, the cost of that vital raw material, which is sourced from Asia, has skyrocketed. It has added hundreds of thousands of euros to their operational costs just in the first quarter of this year.
It's incredible how a distant maritime conflict dictates the price of everything for you, the listener. It impacts the cost of your dishwasher tablets, the construction materials for your home, even children's toys. The ripple effects are everywhere. Elidan, a company in France that makes plastic pipes, has seen their Asian suppliers declare force majeure. Lego in Denmark is dealing with extreme supply volatility.
The macro-vulnerability exposed here is staggering. With global oil creeping toward $120 a barrel, Europe's structural energy disadvantages are being brutally highlighted.
How bad is the gap?
Well, Germany's economy could face an immediate 40 billion euro hit. To put this in perspective, wholesale power prices in Europe are hovering around $132 per megawatt hour. Compare that to the United States, where it is just $48.
Oh, wow. That's almost triple.
Europe's industrial sector simply doesn't have the profit margins to absorb a second massive energy shock so soon after the Ukraine invasion disrupted Russian gas supplies.
And unlike in 2022, European governments don't have the fiscal room left to just bail everyone out with massive state subsidies. Debt is too high. Companies are being forced into freezing hiring, considering severe job cuts, pulling dividends, and canceling long-term expansions.
This leaves us with a critical, extrapolative thought to mull over. If the industrial heartland of Europe can be brought to its knees repeatedly by a single maritime blockade or regional conflict, we have to ask if the era of globalization has peaked.
That's a scary thought.
Could the next era of global industrial supremacy belong not to nations that master the hyper-efficient, just-in-time global assembly line, but rather to nations that build localized, heavily redundant, and entirely domestic circular economies?
Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.